Hello, in this video I'll be talking about setting up Active Directory for Unisphere authentication and management. This video has 4 sections. First, we'll go through an overview of Active Directory and LDAP. Then we'll look at the parameters needed to set up AD authentication in Unisphere. After that, a short demo in Unisphere to go over the setup of Active Directory. And finally, we'll look at where to look for more information. Active Directory is a directory service provided by Microsoft. It is one of the most commonly deployed directory service used by small commercial companies to large enterprise corporations. It provides a central location for network administration and security, as well as single sign-on to network resources. Active Directory uses LDAP, that is Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. LDAP is an industry standard protocol for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information services over the network. VNX systems support LDAP-based directory services for Unisphere authentication and management. It also supports LDAP-S, which is more secure as the communication is done over SSL. At this point, the LDAP setup is separate for file and block services. The demo goes over the entire procedure for setting up AD authentication. Now, let's look at the required AD parameters for the setup. You'll require the Windows domain name, the IP address of the AD server, distinguished name, which is essentially the login name for Active Directory server, account password for the distinguished name, user search path. This will denote where exactly in AD hierarchy to start searching for users. Group search path. This will denote where to start searching for groups. And the actual groups or users in Active Directory for which you want to provide the appropriate Unisphere role. Optionally, you can also provide backup AD server for redundancy. And if you're planning to use LDAP-S, then the SSL certificates will also be required. Now, let's go through the steps of setting up LDAP in Unisphere. Before we begin, you may want to log into the control station CLI as root and run the following command. This command will regenerate the control station logbox fingerprint and is usually required on systems where you may have changed the IP or the name of the control station. It is better to do this before rather than getting an error later in the setup. Next, let's set up LDAP for file. This is the landing page in Unisphere when you first log in. We'll select the VNX system that we want to manage. The option to configure LDAP is in the Settings tab. Now, let's enter the appropriate values. Domain name. In this area, you'll put the domain name. For this example, I'm using my domain csc.local. Then, the IP address of the first domain controller. After that, the IP address of the secondary domain controller. This is optional, and for this example, I'm not going to be using a secondary domain controller. If you are going to be using SSL, then keep the checkbox enabled. For this example, I'm not, because I don't have a certificate authority set up in the lab. 389 is for LDAP, and port 636 is for using LDAP-S. For this example, I'm not using LDAP-S, and so we'll keep the port as 389. Directory service type. Here you have 3 options: default, custom, and other. Default will only work if the service account and all the users and groups exist in the users container. The custom option allows you to specify the exact container for service accounts and the user and group search path. Other is used for non-Active Directory setups, such as open LDAP servers. For this example, we'll be using the custom option. User ID attribute. This is the attribute that represents a user in LDAP. In most Active Directory environments, it is the SAM account name, and we'll leave it as it is here. Distinguished name. This is where you put the distinguished name of the service account. For this example, I just use the administrator account. Account password. This is the password for the administrator account. User search path. This is where you specify the path to search for users who will be logging in. If the user is not inside this path, they will not be granted access. User name attribute. This is the attribute to search by. We'll use the default here, that is the common name. Group search path. This is the same as user search path, but for groups instead. group name attribute, again we want to search by the common name. Leave the other two fields as default and hit OK. Now click on the test button to make sure the parameters are OK. Now that we have configured the AD server, we need to assign an AD group to Unisphere role. This can be done from the Settings tab under User Management by clicking User Customizations for File. Under Groups, we'll create a group. For the group name, enter the local name for the group. You can call it whatever you want. For example, I'll use LDAP Storage Admins. For group ID, you can specify a group ID or just have the system auto-select one. I use the default of auto-select. Role. This is where you give permissions to the group based on the role. Any user in this group will be given this permission or role level by default. For this example, I choose to give the user the administrator role. So all users in this group will have administrator privileges. Group type. This is where you would select LDAP group mapped and put in the name of the Active Directory group. On my AD server, this group is storage admins and the domain name is csc.local. Click Apply. At this point, LDAP is set up for file. Now we'll set up the LDAP for block. For block setup, we have to go to the dashboard and under Domains tab, select the link for Manage LDAP for block. Since we want to add a new LDAP server, click on Add. IP address. This is where you put in the IP address of the domain controller. This will be the same as the one we use for file setup. Server type. Here there are two options, LDAP server and Active Directory. Since we are using Active Directory, I will select that. Protocol. Again, I'll be selecting LDAP instead of LDAP-S. Note how the port number changes to 389. Bind DN. This is where you put in the distinguished name of the service account, just like when setting it up for file. Bind password. Password for the service account. User search path. Just like with file, this is where you would set the search to find users. Group search path. Again, this is the part to search groups in Active Directory. Add certificate. Since we are using LDAP and not LDAP-S, we'll not add the SSL certificate. After you have put in all this information, click on Role Mapping tab so that we can map an AD group. Now add your AD group and choose the appropriate role. For our example, I'll add storage admins and select the administrator role. Now hit Apply. And finally click on Synchronize. And that's it. You have now configured LDAP on a VNX system. We can now test it by logging into Unisphere using an AD user that is in the storage admins group. Bob is one of the users in the storage admins group. We will log in using his account. As you can see, we are able to log in using an Active Directory account. This is how you would set up LDAP authentication in Unisphere. For additional information, refer to the Unisphere online help on PowerLink.